one of the other things that we also have done within our organization is we found that, one of the ways that we talk about, the solutions we deliver is talk about, well, here's some overexposed data. And we're like, you got all these files that shouldn't be there. You got all this sensitive data there. And they're like, oh, that sounds pretty bad. And they're like, yeah. Anyway, next topic. We're like, no. Like, that's really bad. Like, you need to think about it. So one of the things that we actually we introduced, and frankly, it was really just as a bit of a test, just as a trial. We actually introduced the ability for organizations to be able to assign a monetary value to different types of data within their business, right? And it's nominal, like they can say, well, we know for our organization, that type of data is worth that much to us. If that type of data were to leave, it's that valuable to us, right? So then when you can start to put it into monetary terms, you say, did you know that that sort of Brian in your sales team has got access to maybe $250 million worth of your most sensitive data? Were you aware that you had, when you start framing it in terms of money, it's still intangible because money's quite intangible, but it's a lot easier for people to get the concept of actually the type of risk that their organizations are facing around the data. And we found it was a lot more successful in helping justify why you needed to take those steps to be more secure. Just trying to find other ways and creative ways of getting people thinking about why it really matters. Because to say that you got a load of files and that shouldn't be there, or to say that you got access to a bunch, it kind of doesn't really mean anything. It's not until you actually kind of frame the risk in some financial terms that it starts to get a bit more meaning. We found that was quite useful as well.
We've done similar exercises, and I think that sometimes those can be quite productive. One of the pieces of pushback that we've gotten on that, and I thought this was very interesting. We were talking to one CISO about this, and I remember he said, I think he was talking to one of my colleagues, but I remember I was on the call. He said, well, what's the expected value of purchasing an insurance policy? And the answer is it's negative. It's negative, right? Right. You right. And nonetheless, we purchase these things all the time anyway. So he sort of kind of got himself caught up going in the wrong direction, because he was trying to say it's not worthwhile, right? But then our retort was, well, wait a second. We agree that we can all agree that the expected value for the purchaser of an insurance policy is negative. Nonetheless, we do it all the time. We buy these things all the time. Why do we do it? Right? Because the magnitude of the consequences is so significant, right? That you're willing to make that trade-off. Right? You're willing to say, I'll take this negative expected value, right? It's sort of the same concept of negative interest rates. Why would anyone take a negative? Why would anyone put their money in some vehicle where the expected return is negative? Well, because some of the alternatives could be a lot worse.
That's right. Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense to do these things. And one of the exercises that I think especially journalists love to do is they go through the exercise that you're talking about in terms of looking at the monetary value of the data, and they sort of say, and it's perhaps it's a little bit easier to do in the United States because it's such a litigious society. We sue everybody over everything. So what is the quote cost of a record, right? And if a record is compromised, oh well, that's $26.30. Right. Well, how many records do you have? Well, that's the amount of money that's at stake.
Indeed.
And I think a lot of people scoff at that. Right? They'll look at that and they'll say, well, okay, fine, but all records aren't actually worth that much. They're worth this much.
That's it.
You can't just say that they're uniformly all exposed because we do this thing for these records.
Yeah.
And so I think the way to think about it is the journalists are making a mistake in terms of assigning these values on a record by record basis. Yeah. And perhaps the right way to do it is to say, well, okay, if there were a breach, if your data were exfiltrated, right? Let's go through the series of subsequent events that would happen. Yeah. And then what, right?
Yeah.
The classic sort of consultant question of, and then what, right? And okay, so let's talk about and then what? And it's, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. In the United States, it's, well, you're going to have to report that to the regulators, right? And the regulators are, in the United States, state by state, and then federal, and sometimes even other things, local. There's all sorts of regulators you may have to report that to. They will potentially fine you some particular amount, right? So that doesn't get counted in the dollars per record. That's just everything. right? There is the level of embarrassment, right? There's people lose their jobs, right? And then there are the subsequent lawsuits, right? And I think that that's actually probably that's the trailing end of things. That's the least of your concerns.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
That's for the that's just the indirect consequences.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
indeed. That's quite interesting.
Right.
One question that really leads me nicely to one of the other questions I had for you as well. I mean, like, the compliance, regulatory compliance is obviously, we've had GDPR here now for a little while, and obviously there's been a whole host of different regulations, and it's getting stricter and tougher in the US, and obviously quite a lot of our customers in the US, so it's a big thing. We're quite heavily engaged in that space. But what do you think it's really changed? Any type of attitudes towards data security? Like, do you think that people are thinking about it differently as a result of more regulation, or do you think that it's not connected?
It's a very good question. I think that there is sort of a gradient of attitudes towards these things. I think that I've met CIOs and CISOs who are very, I would describe them as regulatory driven and less so security driven. And I'm not scoffing at that. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. I'm just describing sort of what I'm seeing, right? I've seen that, and that's one attitude. And I think that those folks have become increasingly sensitive as governments and regulators have ratcheted up the pressure, right, in exactly the way that you're describing. And then I've seen other CIOs and CISOs who are far more security driven. And I wish I could say, by the way, that it were industry by industry. I wish I could say, well, all of the banking CISOs are regulatory driven. That's not true, though. It's not, right? And that all of the manufacturing CISOs are security driven, and that's not true either. But what I would say is that the folks who are more regulatory driven have become increasingly sensitive as the regulations have become increasingly stringent, and as more regulations have been promulgated, right? And the ones who are sort of more security focused have just sort of continuously been more security focused, right? And there are a handful who are focused on both. And we love those guys because we think that they really are seeing the full picture. But certainly the regulatory pressures have increased the level of attention that the regulatory focused CISOs have been paying to all of the many issues that they face.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely helping. It's giving a framework in which to think about the types of problems they've got, and it's giving them something, I guess, where they're thinking that, and it's potentially highlighting some areas that they may not have systematically recognized without the compliance being put in place. Like when I think about GDPR, it certainly made them think, well, we probably do need to know these things. That is important, and it's not something we ought to do. Now it's actually something that we need to do. Like, whether they do it properly or not, whether they're box ticking, I think there's a fair amount of box tickers out there, but I think that there are definitely more instances where they're actually sort of thinking about it in a slightly different way, and it's driving. I think it has driven some change in behaviour. That's sort of in some cases. But I think that the problem is there needs to be an implication for not treating data with respect. There needs to be an implication there needs to be that level of implication, and it can't just be. It needs to be financial, frankly, as well, because that talks, and it needs to. Sadly, I think we need to see a few more breaches before things are going to really change, because I still think that people look at it and they're like, we're prepared to take that level of risk, and it's like really. I think we've still got a way to go before we're anywhere near thinking about winning this war. I don't think there's yet been enough pain.
So I think you're certainly. I think I agree largely with what you're saying. I think I'm a little bit less optimistic than you in one particular sense. I don't think that an increasing number of breaches will change attitudes.
You don't know.
And I'll tell you why. But look, I really wish you were right. I mean, I wish you were right. Right? So let me tell you why I see it slightly differently. We have seen this sort of just continuous train of these things happening over and over again. But here's an attitude that I often encounter, and I encounter this, not just within the enterprise community, but just sort of across the board, right? It's not going to happen to me. That's number one.
Yeah.
Right. I've done a good enough job.
Yeah.
I am sufficiently secure. I have put in enough constraints around my network, around my assets, that I'm in good shape. It's going to happen to the other guy, right? And it's very, very difficult to defeat that attitude. Yeah. Nobody thinks they're going to get into an automobile accident.
Yeah.
They always think it's going to be somebody else until they get into an automobile accident,
No,
and then it's too late, right? So
right.
I wish people, I think there's something about human psychology. I just don't think people absorb information that way. They always think, well, it's going to happen to the next guy. And
people don't learn from other people's mistakes. I mean, that's the
right. And that's not. I'm not knocking on people. No. I just think that's a structural.
That's just the way things are, isn't it? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's just a structural thing, and it's very difficult to escape. So I think back to what you were saying a moment ago, having a lot of this be regulatory driven might not be so bad. I think there's sometimes a collective groan, like, oh, another regulation. But and I'm not going to say that the regulators necessarily get it right, that they're necessarily regulating specifically the right things. But I think, to your point, they are pushing in the right direction. What they're saying is, you had better pay attention to these things, right? And hopefully that provides sufficient inspiration for whomever is in charge to say, I'm going to do what needs to be done to follow the regulations, and also I'm going to do what needs to be done to provide the best level of security above and beyond the regulations, right? So I think that I have a little bit more faith, unfortunately, in the effectiveness of regulation than I do in the effectiveness of people sort of learning from what's going on in the outside world.
I agree. I mean, I think left to their own devices, I mean, a lot of the places that people will spend money will be on stuff that makes them money rather than a potential risk of something that might happen to them. I think that we haven't got to that point when there's sufficient pain other than regulation that's really going to drive and change behavior. I think that's probably where we're at. I agree.
We will always be viewed as a cost center, and then you start having these conversations about, and this goes back to the sort of cost per record. What is the ROI on this particular solution? And then the response is, well, wait a second, what's the ROI on insurance? What's the expected value of insurance policy? It's negative.
That's it.
If we continue with that mentality, we're never going to make any progress.
No, we're not.
Right. We need to really eliminate that mentality. And it's, by the way, I think it's become so pervasive that it's gone down to the individual level, right? Almost the consumer level. People have sort of said to themselves, I'm not sufficiently important for someone to hack me.